All right, so welcome to the Accessible Lab. First, I just want to give a really high-level definition of what accessibility is, and then we also talk about something that's kind of, I think, very important in this context, which is this maybe concept you're less familiar with, which is universal design. So I would define accessibility as like the design, the practice or the design of specific like artifacts or products of geared toward making something usable or experienceable, whatever other word you want to say, by the people with the widest collection of capabilities. And there's sort of two. I would say there's the colloquial accessibility, and then there's the sort of the field of accessibility. So the colloquial accessibility basically means, if you might use it day to day, you might say, I want my class to be accessible to more people. And you might mean, by that, you might mean, you're going to follow pedagogical best practices, you're going to have breaks, you're going to have exercises, you're going to have all of the best practices. And it also might be sort of a general philosophy, like you want to, scaffold your workshops and do all this kind of stuff. That is definitely accessibility. And then it also has this more specialized meaning in many contexts, which is specifically concerned with accessibility for people with disabilities. And I would say those aren't so much two completely different concepts, though I guess you could call that second one like a separate field to some extent. But they're more like a gradient. And in a second, we'll talk about universal design, which is this idea that improving things for people with disabilities is also very useful for people who don't identify as having a disability. And something people often bring up or talk about very early with accessibility is that I mean, it's a little, sometimes it's a little bit of an unhappy idea, but most people are going to experience a disability, even if it's only a temporary disability at some point in their lives. And sometimes disability advocates still talk about like temporarily able people and so on. But certainly it's good to think about accessibility because you never know, and you or a loved one could be in a very similar situation, or maybe is now, or maybe so let's talk a little about universal design. And you can hit these little next buttons, previous and next buttons, to navigate through the course. And then you can hit this table of contents to go back to the beginning. So we're going to be on the second section now, which is called Notes on Language. So before I talk about this idea of universal design, I just want to, people ask a lot about this. It's come up in pretty much every accessibility workshop, so I usually just introduce it right off the bat now. It's that there's specific language often used in many contexts related to disability. So that is, you'll hear this person first language. So something like a scientist in a wheelchair, or a practitioner with blindness, or a student with disabilities. And what person first language is basically centers the non-disabled identity of the person you're talking about, or the group. So the idea is to sort of suggest that a person with disabilities is a person with other facets of their identity that are outside of the disability. Sort of very recently, and I guess in the context you'll see that most often is if you're writing a grant or something that's related to disability, if you're reading a textbook, many textbooks, if you're reading something more related to like a medical field or something like that, you're definitely going to see that person first language more often. If it's something made by the government, you're going to see the person first language. So that's the context you usually encounter that. Last few years, so pretty recently, there's been a bit of a shift toward identity first language in dealing with in talking about issues related to disability, and that just identity first would sound more like a blind person, or a disabled person, or a disabled scientist. And the reason I would say it's most common that you'll encounter that specifically in the field of accessibility, where people are sort of using the latest, vocabulary or whatever. You might encounter it more on Twitter. And I guess the idea behind that is, besides, I don't know, saving space, saving words, because it tends to be a little more compact. I have heard people talk about that on Twitter and so on. But it, besides that element, which is, I suppose, not nothing, it essentially is, the idea is you're acknowledging that the individual with disabilities, the disabled person, is that's an important part of their identity. And I would say specific people tend to have specific preferences. Specific groups, or audiences might have different preferences. So I would say just be sensitive to who you're talking to and more context. And the other thing I like to say is, if you're making a willing attempt to treat people with respect, and then that will tend to come through regardless of language. So stressing overly about the language is not maybe the most important thing, right? But any questions about that? Because people, I don't know, people that's come up in a lot of workshops. People want to talk about this stuff. And I'm going to do awkwardly long pauses for questions, because I like questions and I want to encourage them. And I find that's how I get them. So.
You haven't talked about it yet, but on the slide, you talk about A11Y.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I just added that, so I kind of forgot that was there.
What's
a A11Y. Sometimes you'll hear people say ally and so on. It's a somewhat confusing but very commonly encountered numeronym. So basically meaning that you have an A and then you have 11 letters. So don't make me spell it, because that might be a problem. And then a Y at the end. And I guess that is that's really what it's basically short for accessibility. A, 11 letters, and then a Y. Admittedly, writing out accessibility, it's a bit of a long word to type. And if you're typing in a lot, maybe it makes sense to shorten it. If you're on Twitter, maybe you want to save those characters, do hashtag A11Y. But I would say it does seem to confuse a lot of people. And so I try to expand it whenever possible and just say accessibility. But if you kind of get into this area and you're spending more time in it, you're going to encounter it a lot. And especially in a group where people, if it's an accessibility conference, you're going to hear A11Y a lot. So that's that. I would say it's the least accessible acronym for something that, so it's a little bit ironic in that sense, but all right. So let's talk about this idea of universal design. You might also hear universal access, but typically people say universal design. And universal design it's kind of a cool idea, I think. And it essentially means that when you design for people with disabilities specifically, that tends to make things more accessible in the colloquial sense, or easier, or more useful, or it tends to open up more avenues of use for people who don't identify as having a disability. So and there's a definition here, so I'll give you the highlights. The design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed to the greatest extent possible by the people with the widest array of abilities. So, and this is from the Center for Universal Design, which I think is Irish. So I feel like this is one of these things where the definition, you read a definition and essentially says designed for the widest possible people. But really, when people talk about universal design, they mean this idea of designing with specific groups of people in mind who might have special adaptive needs, tends to be extreme to just improve the experience for everybody. And the most famous example of this is the curb cut. which most people use curb cuts every day. They see curb cuts 1,000 times a day, and they might not even necessarily know that they're called curb cuts. But essentially, curb cuts are those little cutouts on the side of the sidewalk. So if you go up to a corner, a street corner, and that little ramp that you see there is, it hasn't been around forever, believe it or not. It's only been around since the 1960s. And it was originally introduced by advocacy by the Center for Independent Living, which was a group of disabled rights advocates at Berkeley. And they actually, there's really cool history, but basically, they would have problems, like they would be trying to assemble to do a rally or something like that, and they literally would have difficulty like assembling all of their members together in the, just getting around Berkeley was like the first challenge for the disability rights movement, essentially. So in some of the cases, some of the people actually went out there with like sledgehammers and actually hit the side of the curb and stuff like that. So it's kind of like some guerrilla advocacy going on there. But as it turns out, after people advocated specifically for people with disabilities to have curb cuts, they turned out to be extremely useful for everybody. And imagine how many times, maybe even every day, you use curb cuts, right? If you have a shopping cart, or if you have a stroller, or before the 1960s, nobody used wheeled luggage. And it's not because people hadn't invented the wheel, really. It's just that it wasn't really that useful to use wheeled luggage outside of an airport or something like that, because you would have to lift it onto every curb. So that's the idea, is that and we're going to talk about in the next section, we're going to talk about some of the adaptations for specific lab contexts and so on. And I think we're going to go through them with an eye for how they actually do also improve the experience for people without disabilities. And I think it's also an important selling point. So if you're trying to advocate for for adaptations for people with disabilities, it does help to show that it will also improve experiences for people for people who don't identify as having disabilities. I say don't identify because I feel like a lot of people have have needs that they don't necessarily acknowledge. It's kind of a gradient or a spectrum, as you'd say. So any questions about universal design? And I kind of want to jump in and talk about over the next section of this workshop, we'll talk about 3 areas of concern for accessibility in STEM. And I hope to kind of get your gears turning, because we're going to have the practical exercise at the end where we're going to do a little discussion on research. But any questions about the sort of the big introductory stuff? I'll do a medium pause this time. And by the way, when I highlight these things, I'm using my screen reader to read the things. So if you're wondering why I have like a habit for highlighting all my items, then that's the reason. Okay, so let's kind of get into maybe some of the specifics of what we're talking about here, and some of the more STEM specific items. Okay, so like you'll often, if you kind of get into this area, you'll hear people always say to introduce is like that there are specific challenges that you'll encounter in STEM for accessibility, and you can kind of imagine why that is the case. Labs are essentially places. If labs were standardized, they'd be factories. You know what I mean? So there's almost by definition in a laboratory, you're doing something at least somewhat novel. And you might be combining, the processes you're using might be well established, but you might be using them in and combining them in very specific ways. And I will also say, we're many of us at CUNY, possibly all of us, and the reality is that that funding isn't always the best. That there can be a lot of ad hoc procedures, processes, and equipment in use in a lab. And there's also the reality that a lab is often a very physical place, in the sense of you're working with dangerous chemicals, you're working with fire, you're working with glass, you're working with other fragile equipment. You are, you have complicated processes that you need to convey to other people. You, you you maybe have non-standard equipment, like maybe you have half old equipment, half new equipment. So there's very specific challenges related to the physicality of the lab environment. Workbenches the lab might be cramped. The lab might be badly ventilated. It might have workbenches that are only accommodated standing, right, for example. So this is what people mean by that there are specific challenges, maybe more so than, say, for example, if like a marketing firm or something like that, where the equipment is more standardized, or maybe it's only computer use or so on. So I kind of wanted to go through some of the most common equipment you might find in a lab and discuss some of the most common ways you could adapt or just broadly improve accessibility in a lab environment. And we're kind of going to save some of the, I'm hoping we can get into like the nitty gritty of your own specific contexts a little later in the workshop. So the first one is, in terms of communication, processes, and procedures, really sharing information in as many formats as possible is desirable, and especially if you can document things in a plain text format, that it tends to be the most accessible way to communicate. And in a universal access sense, you can kind of imagine that spending a little extra time documenting can actually save you time and energy in the long run, right? Because you're not constantly, people can work a little more efficiently, and they can look up something they forget. You might not need to spend so much time onboarding people. You might even reduce chances of accidents and so on if you're communicating, if you're spending a little more time creating documentation. So I would say sharing things in many formats is in a verbal, visual or spatial, and in a and in also demonstrations, however you want to call it, kinesthetic way. As many ways as possible is best, So this is one I know is a little difficult because in a lot of labs you really need to use glass for various reasons, but to the extent possible, using non-breakable, non-slippery items. So people often say use plastic instead of glass when possible, just because plastic tend to be more graspable and less breakable. But there are other ways to deal with that. You can attach rubber to containers and so on. So it's not necessarily the case that you always need to be using plastic, but to be thinking in terms of like gripability and breakability. This is one that I think is maybe has a great universal access case, making signs and equipment, signs, warnings, all that kind of stuff in high contrast, using commonly, recognizable symbols that don't necessarily require reading. So that is also a fairly recent introduction, that idea of like having a big symbol that is radioactive, fire, chemical, and of course that's very recognizable and hard to ignore, right? So also making sure to have signs be high contrast, large, people can see them from far away, and they look a little more urgent. That really does help everyone, not just people like me who only have a little bit of remaining vision. So ensure that field sites and workstations are wheelchair accessible. That's very vague, but that means space between workstations, which can be very useful for a lot of reasons. Again, I know we all work at CUNY and like we don't necessarily always have compute control over our space and so on. But whenever possible, having this space. Having workstations, obviously workstations that are adjustable sizes, also very useful, since you can also imagine that if a workstation is adjustable for, say, a person in a wheelchair, or a person who is of a different height, then that is also useful for someone who just needs to sit down. You might be exhausted at the end of the day. So adjustable workstations kind of help everybody. I'll just quickly go through the other ones here. So, and this is something, if you, this is something I want, if you ever have budget for this or you wanted to try it, I swear, if you install a magnification mirror above a workstation, it will be the most popular workstation. Like people tend to really like these, even sighted people can get a huge amount of use out of them. So these are fairly cheap. They're like adjustable mirrors that you put above the workstation, kind of like with a gooseneck or a swivel. Additionally, if any equipment you can attach to like a swivel or a deployable thing like that, especially water or anything like that, extremely useful. And I have my camera on one of these right now, and you can get them for your, you can get attachments that come out for your phone. You can get mirrors, magnifiers. You can have the swivel put on large metal face shields. So that's definitely make it very useful to put equipment on these like flexible swivels. Lever controls instead of buttons for mobility, disabilities, mobility. And of course, in a pinch, that also means you can use your elbow or something. Maybe your hands are covered in something that you don't want to get everywhere. You can use your elbow for the lever. And then, again, something good for everybody if you can manage it. I know lab environments can be hectic, but to allow extra time. So I know it's a bit of a long list, but and maybe, I don't know, maybe in some cases, maybe I shouldn't be trying to sell you all on the universal design considerations of adapting your lab for people with disabilities. But I do think it really helps to advocate and to fund infrastructural changes to a lab. It really helps to make the case that it's going to help everybody, right? So even if you're, you really are thinking about people with disabilities, I think it also helps to really sell them. So that's a lot of blah blah blah. But I wonder if anyone has any questions. And please feel free to bring up something related to your current lab or workspace context.
So the thing I've run into at two universities, both at Columbia and here at CUNY, is a sort of chicken and the egg problem. They don't want to make spaces accessible until they have the individual in hand who needs the accessibility. And so it's, it crops up that you really can't do anything until you know who it is and what the issues are.
You're
because
hitting
they
the
don't want
nail
to
on the head
spend,
right
all the money to retrofit every lab.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, from an early age, people with disabilities are discouraged from technical career paths. And this is Josh Mealy there who just got the MacArthur Genius Grant. And he's completely blind. And this famous Canadian geneticist who's won like many awards in that field and so on. Like they all have told the exact same story, which is that they were discouraged from even at the elementary school level, but at all levels of education, from elementary to secondary to post-secondary to postgraduate, discouraged from pursuing a field that they might really feel like they have a calling for, and that's. They call that, we're going to talk about that a little bit more down the line, but that's called kind of the gatekeeper function. So that people kind of get discouraged, like kind of by people who should kind of be encouraging them, mostly because, the people who are encouraging them, they're well-meaning, but they think that working in STEM for someone with a moderate to severe disability is actually not going to be possible, right? So we could talk more about that. But I will say, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. B, I think realistically the only solution to this again, we're talking about the medium to long term. We're not talking about today or tomorrow, but hopefully, a little further out, that we make this case to people, right? That we make this case that that we're not going to be, we're not going to have scientists with disabilities unless we develop infrastructure that supports their studying STEM. And I think part of that is to also make this case that adapting the lab, the physical lab and the digital lab and so on, will not only, because I mean, I know funders, I know funders, admins, I know admins, I've been an admin, I've been on the other side of both of those things, and people want to know that they're getting something for their money. They want to know that. So I'd say making this a universal design case is an important thing. The other thing is maybe finding, especially when you're a teacher, we're going to talk about teaching in a second, maybe I'll flip over to that, but I think where you can make the most good right now, unless you are working or supervising somebody with a disability, in a lab context. But I think if you're teaching a couple hundred students with students over the course of your career, say over the course of a 10-year period or something like that, as a scientist in higher education, to really be looking out for these students who would otherwise be discouraged from participating. And I would say it has gotten a lot. It's still in a very early stage, but the story is better. People are less actively discouraged, I think, or somewhat less often actively discouraged. Or at least I will say, sometimes disabled scientists actually kind of slip through and actually make it to being working scientists, right? So it does happen, and I don't know. If you can find the 2 or 3 people who need their encouragement when you're there to provide it, then I think you're really contributing to helping all of this, right? Sorry, that was a big. I did feel somewhat strongly about this. As someone who, with a pretty severe visual impairment, who is kind of discouraged from going into more mathematical areas, even though I kind of always liked math and I always liked programming, but I was kind of discouraged from going into those areas, and I had to come to it much later in life. I really think that it's important to be doing this kind of work and encouraging people. So, any other questions? I promise not to rant quite as long if you ask another question.
So following up on what Brian suggested, my worry is even if you provide certain space in the laboratory, the instruments we use in STEM field, not necessarily accessible.
Yeah, so which ones are you, throw out some examples just
like even a simple microscope.
Yeah. Now,
Like
I think a microscope is a great example. I would say, for example, we're thinking mobility, right? That's one issue. We're talking sensory, right? So if you have a visual impairment, obviously using a microscope is difficult. So I'd say those are the first 2 that come to mind. And I would say there's a couple of ways to approach this, right? One is that there's been a lot of development in terms of digital microscopes and digital. So 30 years ago, 40 years ago, I would say, yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure, unless you had access to specialized fabrication, how would you make a microscope more accessible? But even I have 2% remaining vision, and I could probably purchase right now a microscope that I could use. I mean, it might not be, it's possible it might not be of the quality that is used in your laboratory. But, with, these digital microscopes have come a really long way. So it might not be the one that you have in your closet, but there are microscopes that are, maybe, obviously, if you're totally blind, you're not going to be looking for the microscope, right? I'd say that there are ways to adapt these things. The other thing is that, for example, Josh Mealy, right? So I kind of really I'm very impressed by this guy, and he just happened to win the MacArthur Genius Grant. And he is a computer scientist, and he works a lot with hardware. which you wouldn't really, an electrical engineer, and you wouldn't anticipate it would be so easy for a completely blind person to be working with soldering irons, right? Look, soldering irons are not really known for their accessibility as a tool, right? And even many or most sighted people are kind of terrified to use a soldering iron. But what he kind of did over years is he built tools that allowed him to then build the tool that would allow him to do the job. And he sort of developed, he called it meta making. And it's sort of a way of thinking about, and this is also something I studied too, which is the idea of accessibility. But it's all, I think if you can try to think creatively, and in terms of like how to get from point A to point B, and if, you know, essentially if there's a will, then it's usually a way. Now you might, will it be more expensive? Possibly. Will it take longer? Very probably, right? So the question is, in what context will you be allowed and able to support people to do this kind of work, right? Which may not be every context, you know, I mean, and you're one person, you know, in a lab, we're all one person trying to do our best and do advocate and do all this kind of stuff. So you also have to be pragmatic. But I guess what I'm telling you in this workshop is don't be too pragmatic, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Because if you can imagine, so often people can do more than you could imagine from the first 5 minutes of thinking about how they would do it. So,
Thank you. Yeah.
yeah, thanks. And these are great questions. And I try to be practical. And realize that we are a community often, and we are, you know, have limited funding, limited energy, but you know, if I can get you guys to think that for 90 minutes about how someone might do something instead of a shorter amount of time, then I'll be very happy. So,
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I mean, this may not be entirely relevant, but because I'm not teaching a class that uses computers or equipment at, for this semester, but I do have a student who uses sign language interpreters in my class, and I was not contacted before the class about this. The student hasn't requested any accommodations or anything like that. But I do have one of my assignments for the class is a student presentation, which could be either in the class or it can be recorded presentation. So I'm just wondering, should I be proactive in terms of asking the student if if she needs any accommodation, or should I just wait?
Can I ask, do you have any kind of relationship with the student, like in the sense that have you had conversations with the student?
No, she, again, as I said, she
It's
hasn't
more of a lecture class.
No, no, I have like discussions and but she hasn't really contacted me in the context of asking for anything. I just see the interpreters in class. They haven't contacted me about anything.
And this is
either.
undergraduate.
This is an undergraduate online synchronous class.
I guess so. I will tell you. So I guess I'll try to tell you a little bit about the experience of sitting on the other side of the table, because I think if you think back, maybe you guys were more organized than I was as an undergraduate, but I would. You would be surprised at how surprisingly difficult it can be for students with disabilities to advocate for themselves and to like speak up and ask for things, right? So, and even if you just think about the median undergraduate or a random undergraduate, it's like, they're going to be kind of a little bit dysfunctional in a few different ways, right? Or maybe they won't have study skills, or maybe they won't have this, or maybe they won't have that. And this is kind of something that like a student with disabilities typically has to learn, this skill, which is like self-advocacy, which is very scary, to like go up to a professor and ask them for a specific accommodation, or to explain to the professor. And then usually students get this kind of like burned a little bit, because you ask for something and then you don't get it, or you ask for something and then maybe it goes kind of badly, or this person gets mad at you. And this actually does kind of happen, right? And I had experiences of this as a student, and often students, which sounds a little crazy if the student is a they're using a sign language interpreter. But students, they want to feel normal, they want to pass, so they usually ask for kind of the bare minimum. So I guess this is a very long, I just kind of want you to get into that mindset. And I guess I would say, personally, I would, and this isn't the canonical answer necessarily. This isn't the one true answer from a disabled person to you. But if it was me, I'd go up and ask the student, right? I think as
Okay.
long as you're respectful and you have the student's best interest and you're not questioning the student's presence to be there, which of course you wouldn't do. But people do it.
No.
Then go ahead and ask them. Just treat them like a student in your class and be like, hey, say something like, hey, I noticed that you're using a sign language interpreter. We have a presentation coming up in a couple of weeks. I just wanted to ask you if you had any concerns about the presentation. Maybe like ask it in a more open-ended way. Don't be like guessing. Don't try too hard to guess what the student, you know what I mean? Might need.
Well, no, I completely understand, and that's why I didn't want to ask her because I didn't want to make her feel as if I know that she would have any difficulty with that. But she could have emailed me or whatever, but she hasn't, and that's why I've been wondering maybe what was the best way. But yeah, I can just send her an
I'd
email.
say just ask her, and ask her in like an open-ended way. Like you could say something like, I noticed you have a sign language. You don't have to say something like, I noticed you're deaf, because you never know if the student might have that adaptive need, but they might not actually be the thing that you think they are. Like maybe they have processing issues, or maybe, you know what I mean?
Right.
So I guess you could just, probably the most neutral way you could probably approach that would be to say something like, I noticed that you're using an interpreter, or sign language, or whatever you're seeing. And I just wanted to ask if you had any questions or concerns about the
Right. Okay.
Right.
Thank you so much.
That's so, and that's pretty damn sensitive. Like, no, you're not. You know what I mean? I don't think anyone could.
Right. Well, interestingly enough, I've been teaching in Queens College for, over 12 years. This is my first student that uses sign language interpreters. Isn't that crazy? Like,
yeah, I mean, a little, but the thing is, like, so for example, I now at my age, I'm 35, and I have 2% vision remaining, right?
Right.
But I would say maybe only a quarter of my professors in undergraduate education knew that I had a visual impairment, when it was moderately severe then. It wasn't quite as bad. And then I would say it's also very true of students who are hard of hearing. They tend to like muddle through. And a lot of students, they don't, they muddle through. It might affect their grades, but they refuse to, I won't say refuse, it's too strong, but they will avoid getting the adaptations that they should have, right? And for example, for me, I have only 2% vision, and I only started recently using a cane, which I really probably should be using, right? But it's recently, mainly because I don't want to be seen in that way, right? And I'm a 35-year-old practitioner, I'm mid-career, right? And I would say I even have reasonable social skills to navigate social situations and stuff that undergraduates haven't developed yet, right?
Yeah.
And I still have those feelings, right? So, and that's because realistically, it is because people A, have bad experiences, and B, there really is ongoing pretty strong discrimination, right? About and assumptions that people make. So, so I guess that's just where I'm.
Okay.
So I guess that's a long way of saying you may have had students who are deaf or hard of hearing, but you know what I mean. You may not have, but they weren't at the point where they were getting the adaptations that they should have had.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. Okay. Thank you so much.
Of course. Yeah. So we've been kind of talking about this, but like just to talk about education, this educational context. And we've touched on some of these things, but these basically want to talk about two areas. So one is access to information, and one is educator attitude. So that, and we touched on both of these things. That the educator attitude is kind of the gatekeeping function thing that I was talking about. So, you know, in a classroom context, you're getting information across in a lot of different formats, right? So you might be giving a lecture. You might be assigning reading. You might be, I mean, not even might, this is most cases, right? You will probably be having office hours and informal meetings. So the best practices thing, and this I would say this is good for everybody, right? That, you know, if you share a syllabus, you don't just print it out and hand it out. You'll have it on a website in some format, whether it be Blackboard or your personal website or whatever. If you have if you give a lecture, you know, best practice, if you can, prepare, you know, write up your notes, and you know, put them on the website, or send them out as in an email. And honestly, this helps everybody. It's not just for people with disabilities. Like, students really respond well to these things, and they learn better because a lot of students have trouble following a lecture, and they will get something out of reading the notes. You know, I mean, I'm sorry if I'm saying obvious things, but you know, it's something that improves all of. It's something you'll still encounter a lot, is that there will be a lecture, but there won't be accompanying things. I will also say, as a teacher, like if you teach a class twice, you will save yourself time by preparing the notes beforehand, because you forget everything after you know, you don't remember anything into the next semester. And if you have the notes, it just saves you so much work. And also, I don't know, it's kind of cool. I prepare pretty extensive notes for classes and so on, and other people want to use them. You know, like, people are always asking me for, you know, so like, it's kind of cool to be the person people are asking for the materials, you know, this kind of gives you and who knows, it might turn into a textbook, or it might turn into a something else for you, like another project. So other things, so I'm going to kind of skip over this, but this is kind of examples of things that examples of ways that that students might the kind of issues students might face when they're accessing information. So one that we haven't really talked about yet is this. We haven't really talked about cognitive disabilities at all, but this is something I think comes up a lot at CUNY, that is this fairly significant crossover in some cases with students who have, say, cognitive disabilities such as autism, and who have difficulty processing or decoding, I think is the word, sort of the informal or kind of unstated rules of the STEM environment or the academic environment. There's a lot of crossovers between those students and, say, for example, ESL and foreign students, right, who might be in a new culture. So something I kind of do, and especially if I'm teaching, like, say, like a freshman level undergraduate class, is, and you know, you don't have to do this, but I think if you try doing this, you'll find it's like really unreasonably useful for the students, which is maybe a little bit sad in some ways. But I will teach students, say, I will do a very brief, like 15-minute thing on how to write an email to a professor. I know that sounds, but like, you believe me, not only will it improve the quality of the emails you get throughout the semester, but it will really often help students, like, professionally and in the academy, to be able to write an email. Something also, going to the library. So if you can make students kind of like take a trip with the students to the library, or, you know, in the Zoom context, show them how to access the library materials and, like, log in and all those kind of like fiddly things that you don't really, I know they're annoying to teach. And so, but I think baking in a few of these really small, whatever you want to call them, like life skills, you know, whether it be a little bit of writing or a little bit of of how to use the infrastructure at the university can really be a big accessibility win. And you'll be surprised how many students will really benefit from those things. So a few things you can do for this accessibility information is, if you're using a platform, maybe just take a look, like, especially if you're choosing a platform, say you're choosing between two platforms or multiple platforms, like say you do both RStudio and use Jupyter Notebooks or something, or say you're choosing between uploading things to your own website or Blackboard or something, just do a quick Google, see what the state of accessibility of that platform is at this point in time, and maybe that'll tip you over one way or the other. Advocating for physically accessible. So actually doing advocacy to, so if you're noticing, something, I would say, if any of you, I really noticed this when I was working at Columbia, that the physical accessibility there was sometimes really lacking. That students with wheelchairs had to go really far out of their way. And I can't say I did too much while I was there, but I did at least every time I noticed something like this, I would send an annoying email or something like that. And I don't think it's the worst thing, within reason, to send a respectful email to people who might have decision-making or funding power, just saying, it'd be especially useful if you're sort of unconcerned with the issue. Like if you're the annoying student with the wheelchair, you've probably already sent 10,000 emails about this. But if you're a professor who just said, hey, I noticed that this isn't great, like maybe that probably means a little bit more coming from you in a way. That's the implicit thing. I would also say, this is coming maybe from me a little too, as a student who kind of is blind, low vision. Try to pick textbooks that, like if you can tend more to the open side of textbooks, like a textbook in like a web format, like a freely available textbook on the web, that will tend to be better than like a weird proprietary platform textbook, or and I would also say a lot of textbooks and PDFs they don't have accessible like equations and so on. So if you're making a textbook, definitely look into making accessible equations. It may not come up. You may not have a visually impaired student for that, so you have to worry about it. But to just tend toward this like side of open textbooks and to advocate for those things, I think is a great kind of a win for some of this stuff. So OERs as opposed to the proprietary like $1,500 textbooks, and maybe make some of your own materials too. I don't think it's work. So this is what we were talking about a little bit before. Is this idea of the gatekeeper function. And I think I want to say this in like a very neutral way. And I feel like I actually do this too. Like I'm, again, 35-year-old mid-career blind programmer, whatever. And I will often, like when someone is like, oh, I'm a one-armed chemist. It's like, it's easiest to focus on what people have difficulty, what you imagine the difficulties will be for a person with a specific disability doing a specific task. But I guess that I think the thing to internalize is that your first reaction when hearing about a specific disability doing a specific field is you focus on what won't work, right? And that's often because it's hard to have the sort of immediate, to have that imagination or that experience that comes with just like living that disability day to day. So a lot of people, I feel like, really struggle with like how blind people a common thing on blind people using the internet, for example, is blind people are on a forum and doing all this kind of stuff on the internet, and then people come in and realize like, you guys aren't really blind because you're using computers, and computers are visual, right? But it's not really, computers aren't actually visual, they're informational, right? And information can be represented different ways. So blind people use screen readers to access information, which can be challenging sometimes because it's not the way that everyone accesses information, and some kind of information is hard to get into that format. but that kind of does represent a form, that kind of failure of imagination, right? That people don't think, oh, there's actually a way that this can be done, you know? Or if you're thinking of a chemist with one arm or something similar to that, you know, it's like, well, how would you pour things from one thing to another? But I think, you know, the reality is someone who with that disability has that disability all the time, and you get really good at at adapting to your specific disability, right? And the person with the disability might see ways forward that you don't necessarily see right away. And also, if given time in the field, they may come up with adaptations that that if they get kind of kicked out of the field, or if they get kept, they might not have had time to solve the problem. So even if it's like, realistically, I don't think you're ever going to be able to do this. Sometimes having someone stay in the field can actually, you know, result in like creating a path forward, you know, creating new different kinds of adaptations. I'm just double checking that there's no way looking to get knitted. I saw a little allow. Someone got kicked out. Okay. Hope that notification wasn't there for too long. Okay. So I would say, you know, in terms of your attitude, just be forbearing, like listen first, you know, wait for that moment of imagination where you actually might be able to see forward to solving the problem, and give things time, you know, give things a little time to breathe, and don't discourage too quickly, right? And it's good to be realistic in some cases, but don't discourage quicker than you have to, right? And this is what.
Can I ask?
Yeah, please.
So the biggest problem I always have is the charts and the colors on the slides, which some students don't get it. The problem I had then, I had checked the website to which color which is accessible. And when you
The
do
red,
that,
green color blindness, you mean, and similar.
right, and then you change the color so that it is more accessible, I cannot figure it out the difference, because it's the contrast is not that great.
Yeah.
And I'm a biology professor, so for me to get that contrast is more important in order to explain things. So the only the way around I now do it, I just say that this color is green or this color is red, but because on the spectrum I need the best contrast color to be used, and that is not necessarily accessible. So is there any better solution?
Yeah, I would say there are palettes you can choose from. So for example, I don't know if you ever used like Matplotlib or whatever, but like there are palettes that are designed to be more high contrast, and also to be, there's two main types of color blindness. Like there are a bunch, but there's the two ones that you encounter most often. So if you can find one of these palettes, and then should be both pretty high contrast and accessible for the most common forms of color blindness. And it's a little annoying to look them up. If you send me an email after, and I'm giving my email anyway, but you know, I'll make sure that they send my email, you know, in the follow-up to the. But if you send me a quick email, this is essentially what you're asking. It's a technical question, right? That it's that you need, what you need is the best possible palette, and it also kind of depends on if you're making a pie chart, or if you need a gradient or something, you know. So this is actually, in visualization, these are actually like, these are technical questions, right? So if you send me an email saying, hey, like this is what I'm trying to do, and I should be at the minimum be able to share some resources.
Sure.
With you.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. Thanks.
It's kind of an interesting problem in a way, because it's like, you know, if you create, and that's something, if you try to make it accessible too much for one group, maybe it'll hurt another group, which is something that sometimes happens, right? But I'd say fundamentally it's a technical solution to that problem. So which is kind of almost the best kind of solution space to be in. It's the social problems that are the real hard problems. The technical problems tend to be more tractable, right? So really briefly, I also wanted to talk about this. This is an education issue, but it's also a little bit related to what we're going to talk in the next section, which we might have to rush through a little bit, which is equations present a specific annoying and thorny issue for people with a visual impairment. So I would say, especially if you're designing a textbook, because that's where you're going to have the biggest impact. If you're creating materials, original materials, do look into using MathJax. So if you say, so there's this program MathJax, and there's one or two others, but MathJax is the big one. And basically, it will take various formats where you can define equations. So obviously text and so on is the big one. And then it will convert it into a format that is accessible. And then you can like paste it back into your book or whatever, right? And typically certain formats tend to be more accessible than others. So HTML is sort of like tends to be the most accessible format. But you can paste it into a Microsoft Word document. You can paste it into a PDF, back into LaTeX if you have to. So something to be aware of, especially if you're creating original materials. Now, if it might be an interesting exercise to look into the textbooks you use just to see if they're accessible. If you don't have a visually impaired student, I understand that this is a lot of extra work to be doing for something that's very hypothetical, but maybe you'll be interested just to see if it is or not, and in the case where you encounter a student who needs this kind of stuff, please do make sure to send emails to annoy people who make the books, annoy the publishers. There's only so many scientific publishers at this point, really. So like it can actually make a pretty big effect if they're getting emails from practicing scientists and practicing educators saying, hey, like make books that have equations that actually work, and thankfully these are getting a little more common, like that publishers will actually try to make sure that the equations are accessible. But that's a sort of especially thorny area to be aware of. And I could get into charts and so on too as a specific area of concern too, but I won't bother with charts right now. So I wanted to talk about, basically we're going to talk about the digital lab, which is like, this increasing area where, you have to do data analysis. That's an increasingly big part of scientific work. And I would also say it's an area where people with disabilities can tend to be, there's the biggest potential for people with various forms of disabilities to really contribute in this kind of opening up area of data analysis and so on. But it does have its own specific concerns, especially for people with disabilities who have mobility disabilities. So for example, if you have to use a keyboard and not a mouse, that can present some very specific challenges for this kind of software, because the software needs to be set up so that you can use the keyboard. And then if you have visual impairment, then a lot of these platforms can be sort of dubiously accessible, right? So I'm curious to know what digital environments you all use, but kind of here I wrote very brief little notes on Python, R, and MATLAB. And that was my big thing at Columbia, was training scientists to use Python and R and switch over from MATLAB. But just really brief update on like where these things are at with accessibility, because so unfortunately Jupyter notebooks, which are kind of the biggest scientific stack environment for Python, are not accessible for blind data analysts, scientists, whatever, right now. So Colab is sort of a quick and dirty workaround. So Google has created a Jupyter notebook environment for that is sort of a fork or an adaptation of Jupyter notebooks, and it is accessible. Probably because Google doesn't want to be sued, right? So that's one workaround. If you're sort of allowed to use Colab, you can recommend that your students use Colab. Any screen reader users you encounter. And then the other thing is that visually impaired students can use Visual Studio Code and which is the text editor, probably the most popular text editor right now, released by Microsoft, and the command line to run Python code, which may not have all the affordances that Jupyter Notebooks do, but you can use Anaconda with all the data science tools and one of those environments. So that's sort of where it's at right now. And that's what I've been working on with the Space Telescope Science Institute people, is trying to take some steps toward making the Jupyter Notebook environment a little more accessible. The situation is a lot better. So if you're using with RStudio, but you want your students to be using the web version, the desktop version of RStudio. So hopefully Jupyter Notebooks can get to that point. And then MATLAB, for this workshop, I tried my best to research whether or not MATLAB, don't have access to MATLAB currently. I tried to research whether or not MATLAB is accessible for blind students. They have an accessibility statement. They seem to be doing work on it. My guess is it may be a bit accessible, but since there's literally doesn't seem to be anything on the internet about it, I asked in some forums and stuff, nobody seems to have used it. So this is a mystery. If you have access to MATLAB, I'd actually be fairly curious about this. So maybe if this is something you're interested in, reach out to me and maybe we can write a blog post or something like that about this. But I don't currently have access to MATLAB right now. So and that's something I'm curious about. So that's a bit of a question mark, but they are working on it. They have an accessibility statement. I've linked to that there. I'm curious what you all are using right now, like in terms of teaching students and working in a lab environment. But I don't know if you just want to throw some talking names out there. No Fortran? No.
I don't really use any of these platforms.
Do you use what do you use for now? Do you use Excel or
Excel for what?
I'm just wondering what you use for data analysis. If you do do data analysis or simulations, what do you use for data?
That would be Excel, Microsoft Excel.
Microsoft. So I should have put that down here. Excel tends to be, it's actually pretty, I think it's pretty good at this. In 2022, Excel is pretty good for accessibility. I should have written that down here, but honestly, Excel is probably still the top tool for this, or the most commonly used tool, let's say. I personally am more on the programming side of things, but it's pretty accessible. So it's not the worst story though. All right, so I wanted to we have about 15 minutes, and I think maybe we could take 10 minutes and let's pick one of these. Maybe let's do this. Let's just do this one because I'm kind of curious about what you guys have to say about it. And we're a small group here, so we're not going to break out or anything like that. But if you could just take, in this exercise you have a say you have a master student coming into your working group. And I wrote this deliberately vaguely because I kind of do want to hear about your own specific contexts in your field. So just think about your field and imagine you have a student who was born with one arm coming into your lab. Or doesn't have to be a lab, could be your working group, could be your whatever, you know. And you know, again, you know, we don't want to overthink about what the challenges the student will be facing in a sense before we talk to them, but just as an exercise and to think about your own lab environment, what do you think well, let me just say it the way I wrote it. Yeah, so what tasks might you want to discuss with Louis, right? I guess we don't want to assume he can't do anything right off the bat, but what tasks might you want to discuss with him, you know? Especially just think about the most commonly performed tasks in your context. I guess especially physical ones. And then, I don't know, what adaptations do you think, like very high level, like can think of it this universal design way, what changes? Do you think there are any easy wins you could pick up even before like Louis showed up and you had a discussion? Is there anything you could kind of easy wins you could rack up in terms of accessibility around your lab, like in terms of the physical lab environment, you know, we discussed this a little bit, but just think about, let's just take and think about focus on those first two. Since we have a short amount of time, why don't you just focus on those first two questions, and then take 5 minutes just to do a quick think and a quick Google. You know, feel free to just look on Google and be like, oh, like, what could I do for this? What could I do for that? And then basically when we come back, I'll just have you say your fields, and then we'll each try to think of a specific item in the lab that maybe could be improved. Okay. So just take 4 minutes on the clock, 8:17. Let's reconvene at like 8:22. Okay. And I'm gonna use the bathroom. Sorry, I didn't have my headphone in case anyone said anything.
I have some solutions.
Cool. 8:20. Let's give people another 90 seconds. I have a good one too. I just thought of it when I got up. Okay, let's, you want to try yours?
Yeah, sure. It may be not interesting, but I'll try. So we had we do a lot of one-hand pipetting. And generally, most of the people are right-handed. So my whole lab, everything is set up, the instrument with the plug, everything is set up with the right-hand side. So when there was one person came to my lab who was left-handed, I had to shift everything for
Yeah.
that person to work. So the easy solution for me was, of course, I couldn't change the electrical plugs and all that, but I used a wireless pipetter. That was one way to
So it
resolve
didn't
that.
have the wire didn't interfere. It didn't come across the workstation.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very confined area, so we couldn't do much. We need to have a trap to collect some liquid. That also was difficult, but at least the pipetting we could, and that also we fixed with an different instrument with the trap on the left hand side, and use the charge pipetter.
That sounds
That
great. Well, I like that one. I probably tell people about that one in another workshop. So
Okay,
that seems like a
sure.
great example.
But that was the time I said, oh my goodness, if I wouldn't have realized that person was struggling all the
And that's
time.
10% of the population too, you know. So
Yeah, yeah. So that's my 2 cents.
that's a good one. That's a great one.
So I
go
was
ahead.
thinking that because I know when I taught statistics, all we had was computers, and people used to code and run analysis, and so I was thinking that probably if there is a person like that, with one hand, I think, normally it's okay in terms of even whatever person is left-handed or right-handed, because they can just move the mouse, and it's not that's not the issue. But probably if somebody has to type with one hand, they will be slower than people who are typing with both hands. So I think obviously I will have to be cognizant of that. And I used to have an assistant, teaching assistant, who would be with me in the classroom. So I think one solution would be for the teaching assistant to kind of, stick around and see if they can be of any help, during class specifically, for that person.
And if
So.
also I would say if the student has a specific, just make sure you're open to the students, say, for example, using their own keyboard or like bringing a keyboard in or doing something like
Right.
that.
Yes, of course. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would say I've definitely also seen some able people who have very slow, and I would actually say this generation of students might be a little slower on the keyboard than maybe because they didn't have AOL instant messaging or something like that. But yeah, I would definitely say that typing speed varies a lot with between people, and that
Yeah.
can be an important job skill, or it could be not that important depending on what you're doing. That's a good one. Yeah, I would also say, just because you didn't get to talk about workstations, but like having monitors and stuff that like move around in a lab context. I have one here. In a lab context, that can be a really useful, especially if you're trying to do something, and like oftentimes you're consulting a monitor and you're doing a technical task, right? So to have other kinds of equipment, like maybe iPads and stuff like that lying around, and B, to have monitors that are on like these robot arms. They're not really robot arms, but these movable arms are not that expensive, comparatively, and you can most monitors have brackets, and you can just stick them on, and I don't know, it makes them much more flexible tools. You can move the monitor around, and
Yeah.
well, especially
Well,
while you're trying to do something
the
at a
thing is also,
station.
I was thinking maybe they can use their own, laptop, but they really can, because the software might not be there, and
Yeah, it can be a
things like
pain,
that.
and sometimes you have to think creatively, like, oh, can we get them to log into the virtual machine? Can we think that? Oftentimes, I would say, the first thing to do is just to ask the person, like, how could we have you do this? You know what I mean? And I would
Right.
say 70% of the time, especially if it's like a professional in a lab context, they're probably maybe even more, 85% of the time, they'll have a solution. They'll be like, okay, in the past I've done this, but I guess it's your job then just to be like to support them in doing it. Like when I started up at Columbia, I was very nervous because I've had, if I don't have my workstation set up, like I'm not a good employee. Like you wouldn't even really want to have me there. Now, if I have my workstation set up and everything correct and I have my headphone and everything, then I'm a great employee, right? So, but not everyone is equally supportive, right? Or not everyone is, can make sure to get the equipment in a timely fashion or whatever. So I think just being the person to support is often the Do you have any other examples?
I mean, in my laboratory, we have a inert atmosphere glove box, which involves changing gas cylinders. And
What
I
field are
don't
you in?
have a, what?
What discipline? What field?
In chemistry.
Chemistry.
So, these are, gas cylinders, probably a, 50-pound cylinder that, it really does help to have two hands to control.
Mhm.
And when you're
It's like
putting a
chaining
regulator on
Poland
it,
Spring.
yeah. I haven't thought about a workaround. This.
Well, I mean, I have to imagine there are probably people in your lab who can't change. I mean, 50 pounds is fairly significant.
Yeah, normally, it's the big hulky guy that ends up changing all the
Yeah.
cylinders for the petite ladies in the lab. But
Yeah,
the
50
group
pounds.
sort
I
of
mean,
works
it's
it out.
definitely not. I would say in a given lab context, probably fewer than 50% of the people are going to be able to lift 50 pounds, right?
Yeah.
Realistically, that's an interesting one because that's even a little. But I would say, I mean, with a mechanical, you could probably come up with a mechanical implement to do it. If you had to, you could probably have someone, like some kind of jack equivalent or like,
Yeah, I mean they come in on sort of dollies, and you can move you can rotate them around, but the issue comes when you're putting a regulator on it. You have to thread the
it's a two-handed
regulator
process.
screw into the opening. You have to be able to open the tank to blow out any dust or anything like that, and having two appendages will help.
I've seen. I don't know. I only met one person who I've seen working in this kind of context, but like what I've seen with one-handed people is often what you want to do is have like clamp. Like the clamp is the best friend, right? Like you have if you can. And there's this one other thing. It's this website. I should link the website in that tutorial actually because it's a great website. But there's a again like with a flexible gooseneck. There is a kind of a device a holder that it has 3 clamps kind of come down like this, and it's on a flexible thing, so you can set it up with a to hold, say like a jack or something like that, or something, an insert, and then it'll hold it in place. So it might not work for everything, but it might work for a significant portion of things. Say if you have one of these things, you could have it hold the thing in place. And that specific one will only hold a very light item, right? And there's ones that are stiffer and they'll hold heavier items. But that tends to be how people solve these problems. I mean, again, it can be fairly labor intensive and you have to have some creativity and some manual dexterity and stuff on the other hand. But like, if you can use a clamp or a holder, that's usually how people get around some of this stuff. Now, 50-pound weight I'd say that's an accessibility challenge for a significant portion of people in your lab. But that's a really interesting one. And it's the one I was going to pick is at my working space at Columbia. There was we were in Butler Library. It's a 1934 building, and there was a door. The door leading into the building just incredibly heavy, like not into the building, rather into the workspace. So it's an internal door. And it's just an incredibly heavy door. And we had, similar to 50-pound weight or whatever, there were women in the workspace who could open the door, but it was a significant strain, like a two-handed plant yourself, grab the door, like pull. And it turned out to be a fairly simple fix. It was a mechanical fix that they could actually change the door so the hydraulics work better, so that could actually open more smoothly. But that was definitely an accessibility concern of entering and exiting this workspace. So that I would say even stuff like that, it definitely falls into an accessibility, thinking about accessibility. And I would also say the 50-pound thing that you're thinking about accessibility because even though it's not people with disabilities, not everyone can perform that task, right? So,
Yeah.
so you have to think about ways around it. So I think that's a good one. Do we have anyone else? That was it, right? Well, I just, sorry, I'm 1 minute behind, but I'm going to share. I'll share. Please reach out with the question about the contrast, and I should be able to share something hopefully. And thank you for coming. Thank you for being people who care enough to attend a workshop like this, and hopefully to go out and advocate. And maybe I hope that maybe something or a few things in this sticks in your head, and maybe I hope, you know, if you have a long career in STEM, that you encounter someone that you can encourage, you know, develop some infrastructure, make a change. Maybe one of a textbook you've developed will have equations that check out or something like that. And it really can make and it also suggests like looking up, like, say, Josh Mealy or stories of some of these disabled. We didn't get to the case studies part, so that can be pretty interesting to read about how people overcame some of the challenges in their various fields to do interesting scientific and mathematical and engineering work, right? So thank you and I hope you guys have a good evening, and please reach out with any questions, or if you have, you know.
So just one quick note, I think you didn't post the email in the chat.
Yeah, let me
You typed it, but just post it. I think you have to just enter.
Good idea. Apologies for the zooming in, but it'll be there in a second. There you go.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, have a great evening, all.
Patrick, thank you so much for
Of
your
course.
time.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
coming.
you so much.
Your time.
Have a great night.
Bye-bye.
Bye. You too. Bye.